of establishment politics today in Britain, but also inequality, racism, falling wages and growing poverty, but also and especially what we can do about it. I think it's clear that more and more people in this country and around the world are becoming increasingly disillusioned, indignant, shall we say, and not just a sense of being kind of left behind socially, but of actively being screwed by a tiny Westminster elite that represents only itself. And I think for us, the question is, how can we organize to fight back? So we have an outstanding panel to frame the discussion today, to frame these issues, including Danny Dorling, Lindsay German, Liz Feckerty, and Chris Bambury. They'll speak for about 10 minutes each, and then we'll open the floor to you for questions and contributions. The hashtag, in case you want to tweet, is Crisis Britain. And also, I'd like to invite you to stay afterwards to have a chat, to maybe get a book signed or whatever, have a glass of wine, and just continue our discussion. So our first speaker is Chris Bambury. Chris is a political activist, broadcaster and commentator, a leading member of the International Socialist Group, and he's also the author of this book, A People's History of Scotland, and also another book, it's been very busy this year, The Second World War, A Marxist History. So Chris.
I should also add, I'm also a supporter of the Scottish Left Project, which has just been launched, which maybe we'd have time to discuss. But I want to start with the obvious fallout for the referendum, which is the politicisation which is taking place across Scotland. And to give you an example of that, I just want to start with a friend of mine who's in the East Edinburgh branch of the Scottish National Party. Now, I've got no illusions in the Scottish National Party. I don't believe they're a left-wing organisation, but clearly they have benefited from what the fallout of the referendum. He says at his last branch meeting, they had 1,000 new members, solidly from working class communities in the most poorest sections of Edinburgh. And for those who know the city, Craigborough and Niddry, probably the worst housing estate, voted 65% yes. Many young people and many women. And he said to have a branch, we have got to understand, you used to have meetings of 20, suddenly to have this influx of people, not the 4,000, but actually scores of people coming in, is dramatic. Now, the SNP are the main beneficiaries of that, but this is happening across Scotland at every level. Again, the Radical Independence campaign, which again I'm involved in, its conference in Glasgow had 3,000 people at it. It was sold out. To put that in perspective, if this was taking place in London, you'd have had to have hired the Emirates Stadium or Stamford Bridge to accommodate the crowds in a proportional basis. Again, the same politicisation. Taking place 100 yards away from where Nicola Sturgeon was addressing a 12,000 strong rally of the SNP. And every night, every weekend in Scotland currently, there are demonstrations, there are gatherings, there are cultural events, there are debates, discussions taking place on what is going to happen as a consequence of this. And the level of discussion and debate is of a very, very high level. And again, I was noticing that involving many, many young people, and it's interesting that even on the new Smith Commission, which has had to report on this so-called Deval Max, which is a con, but one of the things it's had to agree to, with the support of all 5 established parties, and people should listen to this, is that as a consequence of the referendum, it is now going to be the case that in votes in Scotland it will be extended to 16 to 17-year-olds for every election in Scotland. A demand I think we should take up south of the border as well, that 16 to 17-year-olds showed they were capable of participating in that referendum, they were outstanding in the referendum in my opinion, and therefore they've won the right to have that vote in terms of what's going on here. And I think this is what's going on is a tribute, in particular, to what happened in the referendum and the politicisation of that. And also a tribute, I think, to the left, for once, taking the initiative and getting itself right. Because crucial to the success of the yes vote, not in winning, but getting near to winning. We should remember at the beginning of the referendum process, the yes vote was 25%. The Cameron government thought it was going to win this. Labour thought it was going to win this. They had no idea they were going to come so close in terms of it. The crucial element was in terms of the left taking a decision very early on to engage in that debate, to throw itself into that debate, and to launch the radical independence campaign, requiring some audacity, some vision, and some idea that actually the left is capable, when it gets its act together, of mobilising people and coming to meet the challenge. And we know that's a lesson, you know, from our own history elsewhere, from Stop the War and elsewhere, but it's a lesson we have to keep relearning, that when we get things right, when we operate in the right way, with a bit of audacity, with a bit of verve, with a bit of imagination, we adopt new methods, we listen to people, we engage, we can make a difference. And clearly in the Scottish referendum, the left did make a difference. Because we shouldn't forget, for those who followed it, in the first debate between Alex Salmond and Alistair Darling, Salmond lost the debate. In the second debate, he hammered Darling. What changed in between was Salmond moved left, but he moved left as a consequence of the campaigning on the ground, and in particular the hundreds of people, thousands of people, organised by Radical Independence, National Collective, Women for Independence, going out into working class areas, organising grassroots meetings, canvassing on the doors, mobilising the vote, and selling a vision of what an alternative Scotland could be. Not a nationalist vision, but one of a democratic Scotland and a radical Scotland. And understanding that creates a momentum forced the official Yes campaign to move left to accommodate that, and Salmond won the second debate. And if anyone followed the debate actually just afterwards with Nicola Sturgeon, she was even more radical in some respects as a consequence of that. Now, I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about the situation in Scotland, just simply to say that in a sense, like here, I think we're awaiting now in sort of limbo land for the Westminster general election. People are going to vote SNP in order to punish Labour in particular, and believe you me, the reaction, the revulsion against Labour is really strong. And if people followed it yesterday after Gordon Brown's statement, he was standing down from Parliament, people were livid with Brown for his promise just before the referendum. He was going to deliver in so-called Deval Max, Home Rule, and the failure to do so, which is represented in the Smith Commission, which falls far short of that promise. But what I also want to talk about, this is a meeting about the crisis of the British state, and it is quite clear to me that the referendum in Scotland has accelerated a crisis which has been in existence already of the British state and the British social order. The first crisis it's done is in the political state. Firstly, it is clear there is a huge crisis of representation. People feel alienated from the British political state, the British political order. That is fundamentally what the Scottish vote represented, the yes vote, but it's here as well. Unfortunately, its main manifestation is on the right in terms of UKIP, but I would argue that's quite a volatile situation if we could begin to actually think of ways of dealing with that situation. I don't believe it's cemented in Parliament. But it's also about instability. I mean, quite frankly, who knows what's going to happen at the next Westminster election? But there is not going to be, by the look of it, an overall majority. And one thing I'm interested in is there's going to be an increased number of SNP MPs in Westminster, in all probability led by Alex Salmond. And to give you an example, in any further war which Britain becomes involved with, that is potentially, and I say potentially, an anti-war vote. I wouldn't take it for granted. There was pressure on those SNP MPs not to vote not against the RAF strikes in Iraq. But it means if we mobilise north of the border, we can try and make sure they hold to certain positions in opposition to racism, in opposition to Islamophobia, in opposition to war. But it also means if there's not going to be a stable government, that is going to increase a crisis at the heart of the Westminster system. There is a social crisis, which I haven't got time to talk about, but again, deepening. The fact in the Scottish referendum the yes vote was so solidly based on the poorest sections of the working class shows how alienated those sections are from the British state. And my argument is that alienation exists in England and Wales if we can actually begin to mobilise into those communities in the ways we did in Scotland. There is nothing separate in that sense from Scotland in terms of that. There is an economic decline. And again, I think we're living in a cloud cuckoo land if we swallow George Osborne's idea we're living in boom times. This boom is going already in front of, literally it's exploding in front of our faces, leaving behind the historic problems of British capitalism, the weakest levels of productivity of any major economy, the weakest levels of investment of any major economy, the continuing growth, the decline of Britain, really continuing since 1900, and in a sense I think you can feel that. And there's an ideological fallout from it all as well, which I think is quite important. the right-wing historian Niall Ferguson, sorry, not Niall Ferguson, the other one, the alcoholic one that Mrs. Thatcher writes, whose name escapes me, who had to flee to Turkey, Norman Stone. Norman Stone asked, when was it the Scots stopped buying into the imperial project? Well, actually, I think you could turn around and say, ideologically, the British ruling class has a problem as well, because all the ideological stones of Britain are crumbling in front of it. And there is no, the Scots don't buy into it, but the people of England don't buy into it. I have to say in particular, actually, the people of London don't buy into it. One of the fascinating things to me is similarities in some ways between Scotland and London. For instance, the rejection of UKIP. It's some of the reasons for it are different, but in London there's some very interesting things going on. A young population, many of them in precarious employment, no particular identification with the British imperial tradition, all the rest of it. Again, a very, very volatile mix in terms of that. And I want to end by, so I think we have to take this crisis here, and the issue of democracy for me becomes a really important one. And I just want to say this. When Gordon Brown in the referendum said we're going to have maximum devolution for Scotland as a way of stopping the yes vote, he foolishly didn't understand that Cameron was going to say English votes for English MPs and create a further crisis in the Westminster political system. I welcome that debate. And I think people south of the border think, well, actually, how can we open up a debate about what greater democracy there could be in, for instance, this city? Is the GLA the acme of democracy? Is this the best we can get? In South Yorkshire, what democracy could we get? There is an argument here I think we want to relate to, and democracy is the mobilising factor. And the final point before Faisy shows up, I do want to echo something which John Rees said in an article in Counterfire I read with interest. I think the Scottish referendum shows that there is a desire for politics. I think that people want political organisation. That political organisation might not necessarily fit with a traditional picture of what political organisation was, but you could see it in Scotland. And I think it also shows something else that I've tried to say tonight. It also shows the need for a left. If the left hadn't existed in that referendum, I would say we wouldn't have come so close. We made a difference in that referendum by putting forward a radical vision of what we meant by Scotland. And therefore, I think we have to draw a real conclusion that we do need a left. We need a left that's organised. Now, I'll leave you with this thought. How we organise the left is the big question. It's the big issue which I think we need to be discussing about. But we need a left, and we need to start discussing how we can create the most effective possible left in all parts of this island and indeed across Europe.
Forgot to introduce myself. My name is Faisy Ismail and I'm a Senior Teaching Fellow here at SOAS. Next we have Lindsay Durman. Lindsay is convener of Stop the War Coalition and a leading member of Counterfire, and she's also published widely on socialism, women's liberation and work, and she's also got a book out last year, How a Century of War Changed the Lives of Women. Lindsay.
I think it's very unfair for Chris to end his contribution with the thing that the question is, how do we build organisation and build a left? Because obviously, being next in line, I'm supposed to give the answer to that. And I think if any of us had the full answer to that, we'd be a lot better off in all sorts of ways, probably in terms of putting a bet on at William Hill's as well as everything else than we are now. So what I want to do is to talk a little bit about how we've come to where we are here with the situation in Britain, because I think the situation in Britain is a very serious one. I think it's a situation where over the last few months in particular it's become absolutely clear to people that we now have 2 UKIP MPs. I know people thought they were voting for change in Rochester and Clacton, but of course they were voting for the same people. They didn't seem to be quite aware of this. But it's a very serious situation that we have 2 MPs and possibly more to be elected in May who quite clearly do want a form of repatriation of immigrants, do want to whip up racism, do want to scapegoat all sorts of people who are at the poorest and most marginal in society, including people who come to this country in very dangerous circumstances to be immigrants because they're escaping war and poverty elsewhere. And I think, in a way, UKIP sort of symbolises just what is happening in Britain, that we have a declining power, a power which, even when I was born in 1951, was a power which still had a massive empire around the world. It had lost India and Ireland, but it was still hanging on to most of the rest of it, which was still a very major manufacturing power and industrial power. If you look now at the decline economically, at the decline in terms of investment, and the decline of industry in this country, and you look at the solution for many of the people in terms of the British establishment and the British ruling class, is really to wrap themselves in the flag, to denounce immigrants, even though this country is increasingly dependent on immigrants to do some of the hardest work for money which is simply not justifiable, to hark back to the days when Britain was a great power, to hang on to the coattails of America in all its military adventures, because this gives Britain a sense of justification for its great arms spending, which is as high as its spending on education in this country. It's a question that we have to ask: how did we come to this? How did we come to it in a country which established a welfare state after the Second World War, which is now being systematically dismantled? How did we come to this when we have fought over decades to eradicate some of the worst racism and discrimination which existed in this country when immigrants first came large scale to this country after the Second World War? How come that we are going back to this? How come that we are rewarding the rich and shaming the poor on a daily basis? How come that people like Tony Blair, and we're still waiting for the Chilcot report after all these years, can win an award from Save the Children? You know, satire really is dead when this kind of thing happens. At the same time, people who are supposed to be lauded as hard-working families, which is supposed to be the great mantra of the people that we really support, are people who are working longer hours for less money, whose wages are going down, whose jobs are more precarious. How come we've got to all of that sort of thing? And how come as well that we now live in a world where they create demands for people, and you have this hideous spectacle of people fighting over televisions, who are encouraged to go and buy these televisions in the middle of the night and then attacked by the media when they behave in that kind of way by fighting over them. This is the kind of rotten society that we live in. And it's a society which has become more unequal, which has become more divided, and which is more and more based on low wages, on precarious work, and which is also based on scapegoating some of the most vulnerable in society. This sums up Britain in a nutshell. And if you look at this, this is really, when people talk about class struggle, they talk about class struggle as to do with strikes and to do with industry, and there's not very much of that going on at the moment. But actually, class struggle is the war of one class against another. Karl Marx made the point that the capitalists rob you once when they exploit you at work, where they take the wealth that you produce in order to make their profits. He says they don't just rob you once, they rob you twice, because they rob you as the landlord, they rob you as the shop owner, they rob you as the banker, they rob you as all those things. And we are seeing this on a gigantic scale, that not only are people earning so little, but they are also forced to pay record rents. They are also forced to pay food prices that they can't afford to pay. They are also forced to do all of these sorts of things, and the banks get away completely scot-free. We also have a media which is dominated by an increasingly right-wing agenda. I mean, I look at the papers, I'm sure Liz will talk about this more in terms of racism and Islamophobia, the attacks on Muslims. I look at the papers sometimes and I think these are completely incendiary headlines in papers like the Daily Express and the Daily Mail. They are encouraging people to attack immigrants, they're encouraging people to attack Muslims, they're encouraging racism on the most base and horrible scale, and this is what we're talking about. And of course, I suppose the big question, one reason there is a crisis on the left as well as in society generally, is to do with the role of Labour. I mean, I personally don't have a great deal of time for Emily Thornberry and you know, most of the MPs in Labour, but I must say I was disgusted that Ed Miliband responded to her tweet by saying that he respected people who had the England flag, and this was part of Labour's tradition. Labour people have spent decades fighting against the racism associated with the England flag, the racism associated with many, many people like that. And it seems to me that what they're now saying is, of course, working class people are racist. White working class people are racist. I don't believe that's the case. I believe, actually, there is a long tradition of fighting racism in this country across a whole different spectrum of races, and that is something which Labour is allowing to be abandoned. So I think all of that is very, very important to understand. I also think it's important to understand that actually people aren't, even now, immigration isn't the most important thing that people care about. If you look at a survey last week, so what question do you think are the most important for the country? What were the three things they said? They said immigration, welfare, and Europe. Those are exactly the agenda of every single bit of the press, from the BBC right through to everybody else. When they ask what are the most important things for your family, immigration's nowhere near the top. The things they care about most of the family is health, is pensions, and is welfare as well. So those are the sorts of things that people care about. So they try and make out that people are right-wing. I don't think this is the problem. I think the problem is there is no voice for working people. There is no way in which working people can be represented in ways that they understand. And this is what we have to try and create. And actually, a lot of this is going on. You had demonstrations this week over housing, the New Era people, where hundreds and hundreds of people marched to Downing Street. You had demonstrations last week against the killing of a black man in Ferguson in the United States, very large demonstrations. We had large demonstrations over Gaza, we've had them over the health service, we've had them over all these different types of things. The real problem is there is a fragmentation on the left, there's a division on the left that we have to try to overcome. Now, how do we do it? People say sometimes, you know, you need a UKIP of the left. I mean, I find it a slightly unfortunate term myself. I don't really want a UKIP of anything. So I'd rather that we thought of a different term. But you know, the truth is the UKIP of the left, a broad left party, isn't going to be built without a movement going on. If you look in Spain and Greece, where you have got these big left parties, they came out of big movements. They didn't just develop because people thought it was a good idea to have a left party. They came out of mass movements with millions of people involved, which then led people to the conclusion they could create a left party. And that is something we have to see as the movements being absolutely central to what we do. And therefore, the People's Assembly, the movement against austerity, the movements against racism, those are the things that people have to be at the heart of. But I just want to conclude by saying this. There also has to be some system change going on here. We cannot just have a situation where we roll back hospital closures, where we roll back the latest racist attack, and we don't do anything about the more general system. This is a system which is sick to its very heart. It's a system which is based on exploitation. It was founded, capitalism developed out of slavery and out of super exploitation in terms of the colonies and all this kind of thing. We have to begin to change that, and therefore I think it's about building the movements. It's also about building socialist organisation which can begin to challenge the priorities of capitalism as it is now.
Thanks. I just wanted to get these books here. So Liz is next. Liz Feckerty is director of the Institute of Race Relations and has published widely on contemporary racism, refugee rights, Islamophobia and the far right. And she's also the author of this book, A Suitable Enemy, Racism, Migration and Islamophobia in Europe. Liz.
Thanks for the advert, and thanks Counterfire for inviting me. I was actually asked to speak about immigration and UKIP, and I have a confession to make. On the way here, when I was thinking about what to say, I got detoured and I started to fantasise about why I wasn't rich. And then I realised that if I'd got £10 for every time someone has said over the last 10 years that there's a political correctness in this country which says that there's a left liberal elite that are preventing us from talking about immigration, I realised that I'd be really rich. And then secondly, I thought if I got another £10 from every time Lord Andrew Green was on the Today and the PM programme, then I'd be even richer. And of course, that's what everybody wants, to be rich, because Margaret Thatcher taught us that. She taught us that there's no such thing as society, and that we're all just individuals, all of us who want to get rich. So that was my fantasy. And of course, it's all a load of nonsense. We know that because there's so many unhappy celebrities about. No, seriously, we know everybody's been talking about immigration for the last decade. I'm sick of it. They talk about nothing else. And this is why we've got to the situation where we're in today, where we've got UKIP. The genie is out of the bottle. And as every child knows, once you let the genie out of the bottle, it's very difficult to get the genie back. But I think there is a little bit of good news, and that good news is people are being politicised very, very rapidly at the moment. We only need to look at the housing struggles that Lindsay mentioned in Hoxton. I mean, children and their mothers are being so political over 2 weeks, totally politicised. And I think, can say this safely, the class is back on the agenda in the UK today. And that's what the establishment, the elites, are worried about. And that's why we're having this completely artificial and meaningless debate about flags, and also about not sneering at the working class, because basically the establishment are quite happy to ground a working class person, to grind him or her into the ground, but they're establishing this new norm, you know, because we're all in it together, right? It's not British to be snobbish about workers. And I think this is very, very dangerous, and the most dangerous thing is that Blue Labour have been so complicit in this process. All the focus groups have been sitting around for years now panicking about the fact that they've lost the traditional working class vote. And that's why we've got Ed Miliband, like the Grand Old Duke of York, marching the Labour Party to the top of the hill and down again, all the time to the drumbeat of the sun. And what worries me is that we're beginning to see a new common sense racism, or almost like a new common sense racism that denies racism. You see, racism doesn't come from the state, it doesn't come from the immigration laws, it doesn't come from the policing of migrant and black communities. That's not what was on the issue. The real issue for the establishment is to create a new norm that suggests that racism is caused by anti-racism, fascism is caused by anti-fascism. Tommy Robinson, more radio and TV interviews than I've had hot dinners. Good old Tommy, salt of the earth. We anti-fascists, we're the one who pushed him into fascism because we're self-haters. We hate the nation. We don't want to fly the flag. So, again, you have with Tommy Robinson another form of political correctness, another round of nonsense. So it's the presence of Muslims that creates the likes of Tommy Robinson. And what you have is a situation where somebody like Tommy Robinson can go around causing mayhem in Muslim communities, terrorising Muslim communities. And anyone who's seen an EDL, I mean, I was involved in the fight against fascism in the 90s with the BNP and the NF, and I've never seen anything like the EDL. Never seen anything like the way they behave. I hate to say this, but the BNP were disciplined. I mean, the EDL, I mean, it's just something else. So there's a new nonsense coming up, and this is the nonsense that anti-racism is the preserve of traditional liberal elites. Come on, do me a favour. Anti-fascism, anti-racism, from the Battle of Cable Street to Southall in 1979, to the killing of Blair Peach, to the struggles in Newham, in Moss Side, in Liverpool, etc. These were working class struggles. And the only reason that we have the gains that we have today was because Asian, African, Afro-Caribbean communities fought as a people and as a class to get change. And that history that perhaps the younger ones of you might not know as well as those of us who are a bit older is written up in this pamphlet by Sivanandan, which is on sale here, but you can also download from our website. These were the days when black was a political colour, the colour of your politics. And we didn't try to take over the struggles of the black communities by imposing a class politics from the above, but we worked out a race and class politics as part of the day-to-day struggle that helped to bring about change. Somehow I think we lost direction in the 1990s. Maybe it was the Macpherson report, and it was the idea that, you know, we had the possibility for institutional change. Maybe we lost sight of the real picture, because anti-racism was always linked to community politics. It was the kind of struggles that you are seeing in Ferguson today. That's what they don't want. They don't want communities of resistance, so they give us patriotism instead. A few years ago, David Cameron made a speech where he talked about the state doctrine of multiculturalism. Remember that? The time when the state was imposing multiculturalism on us? At the Institute we did a critique of that concept at the time, but it seems to me what is under offer today is the state doctrine of patriotism. Eric Pickles has called on people to fly the St George's flag and the Union flag, stating that they are unifying symbols for our nations. And I want to say quite clearly that the thing about symbols is that everyone projects upon a symbol their own emotions and feelings, their own lived experience. I think it's dangerous when you have a state directive which is giving the idea that there can be a common reflex to a symbol, or the state can direct you from above what your emotional response to the flag should be. And clearly, I think it's important that we realise that people fly the flag for different reasons, and I, for one, love my football, and I'm not going to object to football fans flying the flag. But we've got to understand that black and Asian communities, the Catholic community in Northern Ireland, have legitimate fears about the flying of the flag. We would not be having this debate in Germany. I've only got 3 minutes, I'm only halfway through. Quickly, I'll have to leave some out, but because I wanted to talk about the whole question about the way the debate about migration is being discussed, I'm not going to do the immigration myth-busting talk, but I do think that one thing that we have to take on, it's really important that we take on, we have to take it on head on, is the idea that it's migrants who undercut the wages of Indigenous workers. This is the argument that has purchased, that UKIP is using, that is having purchased. Of course it's a nonsense as well. The problem isn't the migrant worker. The problem is the way the establishment is using the migrant worker to drive down wages, and is also not enforcing labour protections, minimum wage, the whole crisis in housing, etc. I have 4 quick ideas about some of the practical ways, because I think we need to be practical, that we can take on this very, very dangerous argument. One of the first things the coalition government did when it came to power was it abolished the Migration Impact Fund. This was when migrants came to this country, and let's face it, most of the migrants are highly skilled, coming from America, Australia, etc., etc. They had to pay the money for their visas went into this fund, and the money was redistributed into parts of the countries where migrants settled. And this meant that there could be more money towards, you know, basic services in those areas. And I think that's something we could fight for. The other thing is, a lot of the debate about Eastern European migrants is a code for attacking the Roma. Now, again, you know, this isn't a government. There's something called the EU Roma integration strategy. All national governments are meant to have a strategy for integration of the Roma. The Roma community in this country from Eastern Europe are here to stay and they're here to fight. They've been here since the 1980s. They're a settled community. They're almost the same size with gypsies and travellers as the British Bangladeshi community. And yet a ministerial working group on preventing inequalities for the Roma has not met since April 2012. Because they don't keep statistics on the Roma, they can't actually, our government isn't accessing funds from the EU structural funding, from the Cohesion Fund and the European Social Fund, which will make a difference in the disadvantaged neighbourhoods where Roma live. Thirdly, we could demand that our government sign up to the International Charter for Migrant Rights and the EU Seasonal Workers Directive. They are not perfect, but at least they establish that the way forward is to create a level playing field so that the migrant worker's wage is the same as the wage of the indigenous worker. So fourthly, we've got to do more to support those fighting against immigration policing and the creation of more and more detention centres for migrants and refugees. Immigration policing is the fastest growing and least accountable form of policing. And if they invest so much money in prisons, they need to find someone to fill them. The security companies are licking their lips. To conclude, I was asked to make some comments on opportunities and dangers. The dangers that we face is that nationalism and nativism today is the breeding ground for racism. The breeding ground for this political circus of loyalty discourses, sifting out who belongs and doesn't belong, a hunt for traitors, Muslim, Roma, gypsies, whistleblowers like the greatest traitor of all, according to a son, Edward Snowden. It really is a case of if they come for me in the morning, they will come for you at night. And that's the opportunity. The opportunity is there. More and more people know this. We have to cut through the nonsense. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. So next we have, finally, we have Danny Dorling. Danny is Halford Mackinder Professor of Geography at Oxford, and he's also described modern Britain as the most unequal society since the 19th century, and argues in this book that we can no longer afford the super rich. Danny.
I'll just start by saying a little bit about immigration and racism. A few years ago, with some colleagues, we decided to try to work out where was the community in Britain which had had the biggest influx of immigrants and who were they? So we looked at the census and we found that the biggest influx of immigrant children, children born in another country, was around Hyde Park. And the most common country of birth of the children around Hyde Park, if you feel like stopping a child around Hyde Park and trying to guess where they were born, was the United States of America, because these were the children of bankers and children of the very rich who settled around there. This kind of immigration to Britain, I've got nothing particularly against it. I just wish people would assimilate and not bring their American values with them when they come. But this kind of immigration of the extremely rich is largely unopposed, and you can see it in the Sunday Times rich list. The Queen used to be number 5 or something. Now, and of course, she's an immigrant as well, or a far off one. Now she's way down, and who's above her? It's all immigrants. And we never talk about the immigration of people with a lot of money, and we never, ever talk about where they got their first million. You're not allowed to ask where people who've got a lot of money got their first million. Just a word on flags. There's a lot of optimism amongst people I work with on inequality, which may seem odd to you because you're looking a bit depressed at the moment. And one reason there's a lot of optimism is because a lot of these people have been working on inequality for 20 or 25 years. And for the majority of the time that they were talking about these issues and inequality was widening, the gaps were getting bigger, it was getting worse, nobody was listening. Whereas since 2008 there has been the most remarkable increase in attention about this problem. Now, you may well say it's not enough, it's not getting us anywhere, it's terrible. But if you can cast your mind back, and I'm just doing a demographic survey of your ages here, in 2000 or in 1990, it just wasn't there as a major issue. It is now there as a major issue for fairly obvious reasons. And in some ways, the time and the sentiment is changing. We tend not to celebrate the very rich anymore. Our newspapers do not show young bankers quaffing champagne, paying $30,000 for a bottle in some cases, as they did in the past. We still celebrate celebrities, but they have to try and pretend that they don't have that much money and they're normal. And if they have a go about not wanting to pay the mansion tax, if we had a decent politician, it wouldn't be very hard to shout them down and tell them how many babies die because of lack of proper incubators, because people like them are not paying their taxes. And one point on flags, just to give you an idea about how far the world's changing. In the last year I've moved south back to where I grew up in Oxford, and there's been a big thing about flags in Oxford. And the big thing about flags in Oxford has been about, can you put up the rainbow flag? And when one college decided that the rainbow flag couldn't fly above it, what happened? Dozens and dozens of students flew the rainbow flag from their windows. There has been lots of changes which are worth noting and celebrating. Things are happening. I'm very glad you started with Scotland, because the thing which has done the most for my confidence in the last year is spending just 3 days in Scotland before the referendum and talking to people. And I just asked them one question. I asked them, how many people do you now know who you didn't know a year ago, that you've met, that you can name? And it had doubled. In most cases it had doubled or tripled. I didn't know who all these names were. This was a debate within Scotland. But people's social circles had expanded massively, and something dramatic has happened there and continues to happen. So if you're getting depressed about what is possible and what it might take for things to happen, I mean, that was an incredibly close vote. 5.5% of people voting a different way, the City of London would have crashed the next day. That's what would have happened. We'd have had a sterling crisis because we suddenly have a crappy little currency, not even backed up by oil, the day after. It was 5.5%, it was extremely close. And the left groups that helped organise this, what did they come out of? They came out of the mess of the jailing of Tommy Sheridan. I mean, you know, they were hardly particularly well organised, you know, a few years earlier than this. So it's remarkable what is possible. But let me get on very quickly to what I'm supposed to be talking about, which is inequality in the 1%. And this is another reason, I think, to be hopeful. For almost all the last 100 years, the 1% and a group directly beneath them, the rest of the 10%, had travelled together. When they lost their fortunes and they lost their wealth from 1914 all the way to 1978, the 1% came down, they had to give up their big houses and so on, and the rest of the 10% came down with them. And they became dramatically equal in the 1970s. For large European countries, the only one which was more equal than us was Sweden in the 1970s. We had a narrower income distribution than France and Germany. And one problem on the left is we don't celebrate it and we don't tell a different story of the 1970s and what it was like to live in the 1970s, which is not the story which is largely told by people in the media now, who tend to come from a very small group who are very resentful of having lost their wealth by then. From the 1970s onwards, the 1% became richer and richer and richer, and the rest of the 10% became richer with them. And when you have that, you have a group at the top large enough to win a majority of elections, to control society. And you have a group you can try to get into if you're aspirational. It's not unrealistic to try to get into the top 10%. But since 2008, that pattern, which has lasted for a century, has fractured. The 1% have carried on getting richer, doing better. But the rest of the 10% have actually seen their incomes fall, and fall quite dramatically. Now, this is before the worst of the cuts come in, but the IFS has shown that inequality amongst the 99% is now back down to 1990 levels. So you've got the split at the top, and that creates all kinds of confusion in British politics. It doesn't create confusion for the Conservatives, because they are and always have been the party of the 1%, and the 1% are doing well. But they need to win an election, and so they have a series of economic policies which are really geared to one thing, and that is keeping housing prices high, because that's what gets the Conservative vote out. But beneath people at the very top, which is landlords who are buying up more property, people who are sitting on piles who don't really have to worry about their wealth, there is increased precarity. And even if it isn't for those members of the rest of the 10%, they know their children are facing an incredibly uncertain future when they thought they had it sewn up. And it's very, very hard to run things when that is the case. Now you've got two separate patterns going on. I'll just be a couple of minutes. One is the slow and steady decline of the British Empire. And that's peculiar to us, and it's, you know, Scotland is getting close to the point of saying, as an almost fully co-opted member of this, we don't want out. That's one thing that's going on, and it's unique to us. The other is the widening inequality in wealth worldwide, and the two come together in a very strange way. We don't talk about the last world power before us. You're not taught what it is. You know the USA has taken over. People worry that China, or might celebrate that China might be next. But nobody says who was it before England, before Britain. It was the United Provinces, small part of the Netherlands, which has now become a rather normal European state. So there is a future when you're no longer a world power, but we don't talk about how we get there. We're trying to avoid getting there. There's a desperate attempt to not become a normal country. And how do we do this? Because it's scary. There are all kinds of things that we do that people in the rest of Europe don't do. People in the rest of Europe, by and large, send their children to local schools, state schools. Might be slightly posher state schools, you know, this isn't utopia, but there's a whole load of things that we do that other people don't do. So it's hard work becoming normal, but we're partly engaged in the process of becoming normal. One way in which we're trying to avoid becoming normal is to be a treasure island, a place for the super rich of the world. The theory is that you can't have trickle down everywhere. Even people on the right realise you can't have trickle down everywhere. But can you have trickle down in one country? Can we have one place, the favourite place for the rich of the world to come, where we can be their cleaners and their butlers? We can provide universities for their children. We can provide schools for their children. If you like, one way of looking at Plan A is we'll be Treasure Island and we'll help the movement of money around the world and we'll skim some off on the way. The Tories, the plan isn't simply how can we stuff everybody else. It is a how can we stay great and have some crumbs so that the lower orders, the animals, don't starve, if you like. But that's the way I see it. I'm going to try to wrap up with one reason to be optimistic, which doesn't sound like a very good reason, but at least it tells you you're not going to have to sit through this for another 5 or 6 years. And it's a statistic which Russell Brand doesn't use, and which somebody needs to get to Russell Brand, because he's much better than I am at publicising statistics. And it's about the 1% richest people on the planet. Credit Suisse, the bank, do a very good job of trying to work out how much wealth the 1% richest people on the planet have. They try very hard to get it right because they want their allies and competitors to think they've got a list of these people, because that's a very valuable thing to own. Last year, in their World Wealth Report, they announced that the richest 1% of people on the planet had 41% of all the wealth of humanity. 41% last year. A month ago, the latest World Wealth Report came out, and the richest 1% had 48% of the wealth of the planet. There has never been a 12-month period in world history, never been a 12-month period in world history, where the best off 1% have increased their take by 7 percentage points. Now I know I'm a nerd, but I've got another minute to try to explain to you why this really matters. It's gone from 41 to 48 in 1 year. 7 more years of that and a couple of months. and the richest 1% will have 100% of all wealth in the world, and it's game over. Various reasons. What that should tell you, if you've ever played with these kinds of statistics before, and they happen in other examples, is that it is not going to continue like this, because it cannot continue like this. And you are living through the most remarkable year and years right now, and something's going to happen. Can't tell you what's going to happen, how it's going to happen. But they're not going to take another 7%, another 7%, another 7% until they have everything within 7 years. That won't occur. I'll give you one other example of these kind of things that tell you something really odd's going on. A couple of years ago, Kensington and Chelsea, you know, these very, very rich boroughs where they're digging underneath to break swimming pools so their children can drown in them. Why on earth you would want a swimming pool in the basement? Anyway, Kensington and Chelsea, one of the richest, most expensive places on the planet now. Life expectancy in the Royal Borough was going up by more than a year. For life expectancy, people who are living to 86 were suddenly living to 87.5 1 year later. 87.5, 89. The only way that can continue is if the residents of Kensington and Chelsea and Westminster become immortal. And this is reasons to be cheerful. Something extremely odd was happening. It was a clearing out of the poor, the bringing in of the super wealthy, but it isn't there forever. It's a last-ditch attempt to hold on to winning the global race and putting the great back in Britain, keeping Plan A, and for God's sake, whatever you do, keep house prices high up until May the 7th. Because the one thing that stops Conservative voters walking out and voting Conservatives is if their houses fall in value slightly. They sulk and they don't vote. So if you're trying to understand the conspiracy on the right, it really isn't a set of people meeting in yachts and planning a class war very, very carefully. Yes, they do hate people beneath them because they were brought up to do that, but if you saw George Osborne just trying to sit still on the benches at Prime Minister's Question Time last week, he's not the most capable man in the world. In the short term, it's all about that election, and for voters on the right, it's about trying to tell them that their wealth is safe until they vote. And for Labour, it's trying to address what they are told is people's biggest fears. And they've been told it by pollsters for the last 4 elections, apart from 2010. 2010 was the only election in which the economy went above immigration in terms of people's main concern on voting, because of the most almighty tanking of the economy. So Labour are in complete confusion and don't know what they're doing. The Tories have a plan, but it's a very shaky plan because it's quite hard to keep the highest house prices on the planet stable when people have stopped buying houses in London apart from landlords. It's all a mess. It's all to play for. We need to learn from the victories that have happened and not be too depressed about the degree of organisation it may take, because we're facing an incredibly disorganised future in a very short amount of time. Thank you very much.
So we have about 20-25 minutes or so for questions and contributions. I would suggest that you keep them to 2 minutes maximum, and I will go
and that every city and every community are getting together and thinking, okay, how can we organise a mass protest movement that brings people together and that has some sort of coherence to it? That's, I think, what we have to be aiming at. If you think about housing, or one practical, housing seems to me to be the biggest issue, probably. Definitely one of the main issues. The movement in Britain needs to think carefully about how it's going to respond to housing. We need to have an initiative. We need to have not just a mass demonstration, we need to have a mass national campaign over housing. Once we started to do that, we wouldn't be talking about 1,000 people on a Monday. We would easily be talking about hundreds of thousands of people, but it's getting that coordinated national strategic campaign off the ground. Now, People's Assembly is the effort that the left has started with, and I think it's made a lot of progress, and I think we need to continue that project and enhance it and grow it. But that's what we need. Once people see a campaign that...
To there's a sign-up sheet going around, so if you haven't signed it and you want to get on the mailing list, please do. Also, Fran, I think, I don't know where she is, she's outside, is going to send around a bucket for collection. I think that Ellie wanted to make one announcement about the people's history of music, possibly, maybe not. No. Do you want to? Or maybe Dan does? I don't know. Okay. Well, that wasn't planned very well. If you see over there, yes, People's History of Music. We, Counterfire is organising a little fundraiser at the Servants Jazz Quarters on the 10th of December. And in Hackney, and Dave Randall, who's the guitarist from Faithless, and others are going to be there. You should come along, it's going to be a nice evening for that. And I think Shadia is in the room, yes, and she wanted to say something about this.
Just kind of omitted from this whole discussion the plight of the students, and everything I've been listening here at SOAS, we've seen in Kent.
Chris, Lindsay, and Liz, and Danny.
Yeah, the first thing I want to say is about social media, because I think we did get things right in Scotland in terms of social media, but I think it's also important to say something. After Salmond lost the first debate, there was a scare. And there was a scare among people actually saying, look, the problem is we are talking to each other in social media. And there is a section of the population who could vote yes, who are not on social media, and we need to go out and get that section of the population. And they were on the housing estates in Scotland. And we had to go out and knock door to door. So I think, yes, it's true, we need to get our act together on social media. But I think as well there is a limit, and I think we did come up against that limit in a sense. And it's easy to end up in a sort of social media bubble, thinking we're winning the argument, when actually it was clear we weren't winning the argument and something else needs to be done. The second thing I wanted to say was as well is that I think the comrade who mentioned about the structural crisis of capitalism, I think we also have to be clear that since 2008, the statistics Danny was quoting means that the class war has been waged, the offensive is going on, and actually they're doing quite well, thank you. And that is borne out by a whole series of factors. And one of the things we don't talk about is the reality of work and what is happening to people at work, which is fairly bloody dreadful, to be perfectly honest. And not just a cut, which is near 20% in living standards if you take into account part-time workers. It's much more extreme than the official figures are. But work is grim compared to what it was 20, 30 years ago. And that brings me on to a point I want to make. If I was asked in Scotland who the best allies of Scottish folk were in fighting against the British order and indeed the world order, my argument would be our best allies are the folk in England. But I'd actually add something to that. I would say, and I'm not trying to pander to the audience here, our best potential allies strategically in England are the people in London. And I think actually when you're talking, and I want to address a little bit of the question you're talking about, I think what's happening in London, because it's at the heart in many ways of the whole neoliberal push over the last four decades, it's creating something that's grim, but it's also creating something that's, which is, I think, quite explosive. Firstly, the extremes of rich and poor, which are very, very obvious and don't exist in any other city in Britain, really, in a scale like it, which create a very explosive nature, I believe, at London in terms of that. Secondly, a pool of precarious workers, particularly in that sort of 23 to 35-year-old bracket, concentrated very much in London, with no stake in the system, never going to own a house, never probably going to have a permanent job in terms of contract and the rest of the thing. And again, there's a downside to that, obviously, but the volatility in that, they've got no stake in the system in one sense, in their terms. And I should add, precariousness in housing, which is now going to be a feature in their lives. And that's a whole section of the population which actually have little or identification in many ways with the state they live in. And in some cases actually have got reasons to oppose Britain and British imperialism because what's being done from the countries they come to. I think London is now a very explosive mix. And I think you see it. Anyone who's been on any of the demonstrations against, for instance, the attacks on Gaza, you can feel it. And it's true, it's only 200,000 people in a city of 10 or 11 million. But the thing that strikes me about London is, it's those people who can't demonstrate because life is too hard to let them, because what gets in the way, they support the demonstrations. They are pro-Palestinian, they are anti-war, they are anti-austerity, they are anti-the rich, they hate these people, they are anti-racist. And that is the vibe I get in London at the moment in terms of that. And I think London in many ways actually is an explosive city. And in terms of what's going on here, you know, things that Occupy to me as well raise great campaigns, but they also raise, and I'll come back to the issue of democracy. And we need to bring it all together and say, really, running through all these issues is the issue of democracy. Because it seems strange, you might have thought it was settled in 1848, but there's a feeling that democracy has been denied us. And it's annoying people, it's enraging people, and if the left don't address this, it may sound stupid, but the left doesn't constantly talk about it. We have so much to say about democracy, for goodness sake. We are the Democrats, if you think about it for a second. That's the tradition we come from. You know, it's how Marx starts from, in terms of, if we don't talk about this coming through, I want to come through. And the last point I want to echo is on Lindsay, because I asked how a left is going to come. I think the left has to come through a movement. I think it has to come from a genuine movement involving thousands, hundreds of thousands of people. What you've seen with Podemos, what you've seen to a lesser extent with Syriza and all the rest of it, I'm not saying we follow that model, but it shows that's how it's going to come. And in Scotland, I think that's how it shows it's going to come as well. You create a movement, you get there, you then get 3,000 people in a room discussing radical independence. It then poses a number of questions which are going to come. It's not going to come tomorrow, it's not going to come the next day. It might have to wait till after the May general election next year before, for instance, the Scottish Left Project can begin to really begin to pull together in terms of a radical left alternative. But it is going to come, because once you set it rolling, I think it creates a momentum now, which is going to be there. So answering my own question I said at the beginning, we have to create a movement, a resistance movement, and then actually from that we have the opportunity, if we get that right, and behave ourselves, and listen to people, and discuss in a fraternal way, and don't wave our fingers at them, and don't denounce it all. If we do all that, then we can create a left, a real radical left in this country.
Just on the point about whether it's worth demonstrating, I want to use this, the example of London, because actually, if you look at the history of London in the post-war world, we got council housing and we got people had squats which they turned into housing that they could live in. This was through people demonstrating and occupying and doing all these sorts of things. We fought against racism and fascism by people demonstrating and occupying and doing all these sorts of things. And in a sense, of course you want the biggest demonstrations possible, but they're always a minority of people who start off these things. Sometimes a very small minority of people. And what is happening now is the issues that people are beginning to demonstrate over are issues which are such big questions. You know, the racism inside the United States, for heaven's sake, which is one of the biggest questions facing capitalism in the United States. The question of housing in this city, which these people are demonstrating because it is a matter of their children's future, that they will have nowhere to live, or they'll be sent 200 miles away from their families and friends to live. So these are real big questions, and I think that's the important thing. There's two specific things I want to talk about and then make a general point. The two specific, the point Ellie raised about women, you know, women's position economically, socially, in all sorts of ways, is in many ways much better than it was 30 or 40 years ago. I mean, there's no question about that in terms of women's opportunities and jobs and so on. I think what it tells you, though, when you look at the levels of sexism and when you look at the structural inequality inside society, you can see exactly how far that can go and then no further. And the problem when you're confronting sexism, racism, any of these big oppressions, they are part and parcel of a much wider system, and therefore you need to be able to challenge that system. And in a sense, women's equality has come up against the limits of capitalist society. You can go out to work, you can dress how you like up to a point, but it doesn't eradicate these more fundamental oppressions, and that, I think, is what we're fighting for. The other specific point I wanted to make was about the sexual abuse cases. These were widely known about 20 or 30 years ago. It isn't true nobody knew. You couldn't write about them because of the libel laws, and people like Private Eye knew about them, Paul Fort, all those sorts of people. You couldn't write about them, and it's a sign of the decay of society and of the lack of confidence of the ruling class that these issues are now coming out into the open, and as you say, will have very big implications because they involve very important people in the political spectrum. The political point, the final point I want to make is this: I don't think Scotland is so different from the rest of Britain. And don't misunderstand me, I think it was absolutely great, the campaign, and very, very successful. But actually, this was because they had a specific question that they had to answer, yes or no, do we want David Cameron ruling us? Well, of course, obviously, this galvanised a huge movement of people who didn't. The truth is, though, that we have the same sort of issues facing them, the same sorts of things that were discussed at the RIC conference, are issues which are facing people in England and Wales all the time. And I think what we need to do is to understand that that feeling is there with large numbers of people, that it is possible to build an alternative, and the points that people have made, that if we don't build this alternative, one thing I disagree with, you know, when people say crisis is inevitable, I absolutely agree, and they're putting the burden more and more on working class people, the point that you made. But of course, if working class people accept the burden more and more, they'll keep putting it on them, and that's what we've seen over the last 20 or 30 years. That's why they tried to destroy the unions, which they haven't succeeded in doing, but they very much weakened the unions. That's one reason inequality has grown by such a large amount, and this is something that we need to see. We have to fight back over these kind of things. But this isn't an automatic thing. At the same time, unless we find a way of changing society, unless we don't have society run by finance or any other form of capital, come to that, unless we have a society based on equality, we will not have a society where people can flourish and people can prosper as human beings. And that will mean the ultimate destruction of our society. If we don't succeed in doing this, there will be ecological catastrophe. So anyway, just because Danny cheered us all up, let me end on an optimistic note. All of this is down to what we do and millions of other people around the planet who actually agree with the kind of things we're saying. It's a question of getting together, getting organised and getting these things done.
Gosh. I like what he said. Can you come and pretend to be me? I think that we're living in the interregnum. It's like we're in the cusp between two different worlds, two different societies. Personally, I don't think we're living in a democracy anymore. And the thing that worries me is what kind of form the state is going to take in this new world that we're entering. Having said that, I've been really fired up by the discussion today, and there's a fight on, and we're all up for the fight, and thank God for that. All these years of New Labour, which was sucking the blood out of us. So great, there's a fight on. The only thing that I would say in terms of organising, I agree with Chris. You've got to look at this. If you look at the whole question of Europe, you look at the countries that have suffered the first wave of the crisis, which was Greece and Spain and the southern European countries. You look at the rise of Syriza and, is it? Podemos. I mean, it's just phenomenal. So yeah, the fight is on, but I think the question is we have to come together towards a common rendezvous. At the moment, we're not quite sure what the common rendezvous is. But in coming to that common rendezvous, I would appeal to you to not forget the people who are not here. So many of my friends are now living in a police state. Talat Assam, who was extradited to America, solitary confinement, is now back in the UK. But how can you build your life again when you're constantly labelled a terrorist or extremist? So when we come to our common rendezvous, let's not forget the prisoners, let's forget the people whose lives, livelihoods, ability to form a life has been taken away from them. Sorry if that sounds depressing, but I just want everyone to be included.